In the winter of 1839, when the roads were little more than frozen ruts between fields of salt-bitten corn, the church at Briar Hollow stood alone at the end of a narrowing lane. It was older than any record, older than the settlement itself, built of blackened oak beams that never softened to rot or time. Some said the church had been carried plank by plank from another country, ferried across an ocean in the belly of a ship that arrived half-sunk and crewless. Others insisted it simply appeared one morning, settled crooked on its stone foundation, like something tired of drifting. No matter how many times it was catalogued, no matter how many ministers blessed its rafters, each December the same thing happened. On Christmas Eve, just after the last bell tolled midnight, the church caught fire. Flames crept up the walls without smoke. The steeple glowed like a candle wick, and by dawn there was nothing left but frost and char. Yet every year without fail, the church returned, whole, unmarked, waiting. Before we go on, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what hour has found you tonight? Share it in the comments, so we can see how far these stories travel. The first written account came from a travelling surveyor named Clive Norrell, who was hired in 1841 to map the boundary stones and record parish holdings. He arrived with a ledger and a sceptical eye, certain the tales were little more than frost-season gossip. But on the night of December 24th, he set up camp in the gallery loft, determined to watch the hour pass unremarked. At midnight, he reported a shift in the air, a hush so complete it pressed against his eardrums. Then came the scent, rising through the floorboards. Milk left too long in a copper pail, threaded with the sweetness of scorched myrrh. A crack sounded near the pulpit, followed by a low, steady humming. Clive wrote that the flames began in the pews, not the hearth, licking along the carved backs, like fingers seeking purchase. He fled at the first scream, though no one was inside. By dawn he returned to find a ring of ash around the church's foundation, every stone cold as old bone. In his ledger he noted only 6 words. It burned itself, nothing was spared. After that winter, the congregation never fully returned. Families drifted to neighbouring parishes, claiming it was the weather, the distance, the inconvenience of a building so determined to unmake itself. But those who stayed behind could not ignore the pattern. Each Christmas Eve, the fire would come, silent and precise, and each Christmas morning, the church would stand again, untouched. Children born that season were said to carry the scent of char in their hair. Mothers woke to find soot beneath their pillows, and more than once, a parishioner claimed to see figures moving behind the stained glass during the blaze, slim silhouettes with palms pressed to the panes, watching with patient, unblinking attention. No minister could explain it. No bishop dared investigate. The elders called it a punishment, though none could recall the crime. And by the following year, when the frost returned to sheath the valley, the church doors began unlocking themselves at dusk, swinging wide as if expecting company. By the winter of 1843, the stories had grown roots deeper than any doctrine. A merchant from Fairford claimed to have seen the church aflame from 12 miles off, a single pillar of light rising through the dark like a summons. He swore the fire never cracked or sputtered, only burned, steady and white. When he approached at dawn, hoping to find evidence of vandals or some clever trick, he found the door ajar and the pews intact. Every candle on the altar had melted down to the wick, their wax pooled in perfect circles that smelled of clove and something older, saltier, and on each seat rested a small bundle wrapped in calico, inside a pinch of ash, a single feather, and the name of a child never born. He left without taking any of them, but the next night, his wife woke screaming. She said she'd dreamed of the church, rebuilt in the hollow of her own ribs, alight from within. That same December, a new minister arrived, summoned from 3 counties east, a thin man named Reverend Silas Merton, who insisted no church could defy the Lord's protection. He held services twice weekly, reciting scripture so fervently his voice grew ragged. But every Christmas Eve, the same hush descended, and the flames returned without warning. Reverend Merton refused to flee. Witnesses said they saw him standing at the threshold, hands clasped in prayer as the fire curled around his cassock. When the last bell tolled, the steeple split with a sound like a lung collapsing, and the minister vanished in the smoke. At dawn, the church was unburned once more, whole as ever, except for the pulpit. There, scorched into the wood, was a single handprint, small as a child's. No one spoke of Reverend Merton again. His name was struck from the rolls, his belongings buried in an unmarked grave behind the vestry. After Merton's disappearance, the congregation dwindled to a thin scattering of widows and old men too stubborn or too frightened to leave. They gathered in the church on Sundays, voices subdued, never lighting candles, for fear they might invite something they could not dismiss. Each Christmas Eve, they tried locking the doors, sealing the windows, ringing the bell until the ropes frayed. Nothing stopped the flames. One year, a boy named Jonah Fields was dared by his brothers to sneak inside before midnight and see if the fire was real. He went in laughing, carrying a pocketful of salt and a borrowed crucifix. He returned before dawn, silent, with his hair gone white and the crucifix fused into a lump of charred metal. When his mother found him standing barefoot in the snow, he was humming softly, a tune no one recognized, though some swore it matched the rhythm of the church bell when it tolled alone. That winter, the snow never fully melted around the churchyard. Drifts clung to the graves, in shapes that did not match the stones beneath, some long and narrow, as if bodies lay atop the earth, instead of beneath it. A travelling deacon, come to offer comfort, refused to enter the nave after dusk. He said the air inside was too warm, too damp, like the breath of something waiting to be named. On Christmas Eve, he watched from the hill as the fire began. This time, it did not rise in silence. A low chorus accompanied the flames, voices layered so densely, they blurred into a single note, neither lament nor praise. By dawn, the church stood again, but the drifts had changed shape. Each mound now bore a hollow, where a face might have rested, and in every hollow lay a single black feather, warm to the touch. The deacon left before sundown, never returning to the hollow. By the turn of 1844, the church's reputation had eclipsed its sermons. Farmers took longer roads to avoid passing its gates. Children were warned never to speak its name after dark. Some families claimed that each Christmas Eve, the fire spread further, licking across the snow in slender, searching trails that stopped just shy of their thresholds. One woman, a widow named Eliza Dent, woke to find her doorstep blackened with soot. A single footprint pressed into the ash, bare, small, and pointing inward. She left that same morning, leaving every possession behind but her wedding band and a Bible so weathered the pages blurred when touched. No one claimed her house. No one touched the print. And when the next Christmas came, the fire found the church again, rising in silence so absolute it swallowed even the wind. By dawn, the footprint on Eliza's step had vanished. But in its place, the wood was charred in a perfect ring, as if something had stood there watching until the church had finished burning. In the winter of 1845, a new family arrived, unaware of the hollow's history. The Llewellyns were tradespeople from the coast, drawn inland by cheap land and the promise of a quiet parish. They settled in the old parsonage, a tilting house that smelled of damp hymnals and old wax. The neighbours did not welcome them with warmth. No baskets of bread arrived, no polite visits were paid. When Mrs. Llewellyn asked why the church doors stayed shut, except on Sundays, no one would answer. That first December, she tried to bring her children to a Christmas service, determined to show she was not frightened by superstition. They made it as far as the church steps before the youngest began to scream. He clawed at his mother's shawl, crying that the bell was ringing inside his head. But the bell tower stood silent. No rope, no toll, just a hush that deepened as she turned back home, carrying her son, who wept until dawn without ever opening his eyes. The next morning, the Llewellyns found the snow around their doorstep, melted in a perfect circle, the ground beneath soaked dark as if it had rained only there. Llewellyn followed the damp trail. It led him past the gates and up to the church porch, where he saw a single candle burning low on the threshold. The wick was sunk deep in black wax, its flame steady despite the cold. Though he was a practical man, he felt an unease he could not name. He pinched the candle out and carried it home, thinking perhaps it was a prank, some relic of local spite. That evening, their youngest child woke screaming again. This time, the boy's mouth hung open in a silent wail, his breath fogging the air in slow, measured gusts. And when his mother pressed a hand to his chest, she said she felt something beneath the skin, a rhythm not his own, pulsing low and deliberate, as if the church bell had been buried inside him, tolling only for her to hear. After that night, the candle refused to stay unlit. Each morning the family would find it burning anew, set upon the kitchen table or balanced on a windowsill. Even when they buried it in the snow, they'd wake to its tiny flame glowing against the dark. Mrs. Llewellyn stopped sleeping altogether, certain she heard footsteps in the hall, soft and unhurried, like a child wandering in search of a place to rest. On Christmas Eve, she gathered her children, unlocked every door, shuttered every window, laid salt across the threshold. Still, the hush descended at midnight, thick as wool. She said she felt the air pull tight around her lungs, and in that moment she understood why the others had fled. When dawn came, she crept outside to find the church once more standing unburned. But this time, the candle sat upon its steps. The wax was spent to the nub. In its pool of blackened tallow, she saw her son's name etched clear as scripture. Word of the candle spread quickly, carried by the few neighbours who still braved the lane. Some claimed it was a warning, a mark laid by whatever spirit lingered in the church rafters. Others believed it was a token, an invitation no family could refuse forever. That winter, more than one household reported finding their own doorstep circled with melted snow, a single footprint pressed into the threshold. The prints were always the same, small, bare toes turned slightly inward, as if the owner were waiting for permission to enter. One morning, the gravedigger, a stooped man who'd buried 3 generations of the parish, woke to find the footprint on his pillow, marked in ash. He packed a bag by sundown, leaving his cottage unlocked, and a note nailed to the lintel. "Forgive me, I kept the names too long." No one ever saw him again. By the time spring thawed the drifts, the candle had disappeared, but the church doors never closed fully again. As the thaw spread through the valley, a travelling archivist named Miss Eleanor Cray arrived to collect records for the county. She was meticulous, unbothered by stories of vanishing clergymen and silent bells. She spent her days transcribing baptismal lists and burial ledgers in the rectory, confident that any mystery could be solved with proper accounting. On her first Christmas Eve in Briar Hollow, she remained in the church past dusk, determined to witness whatever truth lay behind the talk of flames. She wrote later that the hush began with a single note, so low she felt it in her marrow before she heard it in her ears. Then the walls began to glow, not with fire, but with a soft red light that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She tried to stand but found her hands rooted to the pew, as if the wood itself refused to let her leave. At dawn she was discovered kneeling in the aisle, ledger open before her. Every page had been scorched black, except for the final entry, which bore a single line: "No record can hold what never ended." After Miss Cray's account, no official ever returned to the hollow. The county clerks struck the church from their ledgers, marking the property as abandoned despite evidence to the contrary. But for those who remained, the church became more present than ever. Each December, the air thickened with the scent of singed cedar and sweet milk. Curtains moved, though no wind passed. Children spoke of dreams where they stood inside the nave, the pews around them filled with figures too dark to see. One girl, Anna Wren, awoke on Christmas morning with soot on her palms and a half-burned candle clutched in her fist. She said she had walked the aisle in her sleep, and when she reached the pulpit, a voice whispered her name and pressed the candle into her hand. Her father tried to burn the candle in the stove, but it would not catch. Instead, the wick crumbled to ash, and in its place lay a single tooth, small and white, as if shed by a child no one could remember. That year, the church did not burn as it had before. On Christmas Eve, the glow rose behind the stained glass. But no flames came. Instead, a sound emerged, low and rhythmic, like the breath of something too large to fit inside the walls. Neighbors who dared approach said they saw shadows shifting in the nave, shapes that moved in rows as though standing from prayer. At midnight, the bell rang once, though no rope remained, and every window turned dark. When dawn came, the church stood cold and whole, but the doors were ajar. Inside, each pew bore a small bundle wrapped in linen, tied with black thread. No one touched them, but all who looked swore they felt the bundles stir, as though something within drew breath in its sleep. By nightfall, every bundle had vanished without a trace, and the floorboards beneath the altar bore new marks. 4 handprints pressed into the grain, small as an infant's, each turned palm upward. By the winter of 1846, most of Briar Hollow had learned to keep their distance. Doors were barred before dusk. Lanterns were left unlit, and yet, every Christmas Eve, the church called to someone. That year, it was Thomas Rook, a widower who claimed he'd seen his late wife standing in the belfry window, her hair unbound, her hand pressed to the glass. He crossed the snow without cloak or boots, leaving a trail of dark footprints that never filled. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains as he passed into the church and closed the doors behind him. No flames rose that night, no light shone from the windows, but at dawn the doors stood open, and Thomas was gone. On the threshold lay a single piece of parchment, weighted with a smooth stone. In a thin, spidery hand the note read, "Some fires do not consume, they keep." No one entered the church again that winter, and when the thaw came, Thomas's house stood empty, his hearth cold and swept clean. By early 1847, what remained of the congregation had stopped pretending the church was theirs. They spoke of it only in the past tense, as though it had slipped beyond the parish's claim. Yet each Christmas Eve, its doors swung wide, as if expecting the faithful to return. That year, the snow came late, falling in wet clumps that clung to the eaves and muffled every step. On the afternoon before the vigil, a stranger arrived, an itinerant preacher with a voice like a rasp and a Bible bound in cracked leather. He announced he had come to consecrate the building once and for all. The locals did not argue. Some watched from behind shutters as he carried his satchel up the aisle and knelt at the pulpit. When the hush came at midnight, he was already singing, low and broken, a hymn no one recognized. As the hours passed, a glow seeped from the church seams, steady as breath. By dawn, the building was unmarked, silent. The stranger was gone, and on the altar rested only his Bible. Every page had been torn out, but one, where a line had been scrawled in ink so fresh it smudged when touched. "This place remembers." After that night, no one claimed to see the flames again, but the hush remained, deeper than before, as though the church had exhaled and was waiting for something to fill the quiet. In the weeks that followed, strange gifts appeared on doorsteps, bundles of white cloth, each holding a fragment of charred wood, no larger than a child's finger. The cloth smelled faintly of beeswax and old milk. Families who burned the bundles found their chimneys clogged with soot by morning. Those who buried them heard tapping beneath the earth for nights after, and some, too afraid to touch them, simply left the parcels where they lay. By the first thaw, the snow around each had melted in perfect circles, the ground beneath dark as ink. No tracks led away. When the pastor's wife finally gathered the remaining bundles to bury them behind the chapel, she found her own name stitched in black thread along the seams, over and over, in a hand she did not know. Spring did not banish the hush. It thickened, taking on the feel of damp cloth pressed over the mouth. Children born that season were quieter than any before, their eyes wide and unfocused, their breathing measured as though counting out a rhythm older than sleep. Mothers whispered that the church had marked them, that every Christmas Eve had been another stitch in a seam no prayer could undo. When the Thor finally reached the cemetery, the graves nearest the nave were found shifted, the soil pulled inward, as though something beneath had settled deeper. No one came to tend them, and when the Thor reached the threshold of the church, the doors creaked open on their own. Inside, a single pew had been moved to the center aisle, turned to face the rear wall. On its seat rested a length of charred rope, coiled neatly beside a strip of linen stained rust red. No one claimed them, no one moved them. That year, Christmas came without fire, but no one dared to call it peace. By midsummer, the church stood, as it always had, intact, inscrutable, its black beams warming in the sun. Yet those who passed too close felt the cold cling to their skin, as though the building carried its own season. A miller's daughter swore she saw figures in the nave when she peered through the warped glass. 3 shapes seated side by side, hands folded neatly in their laps, faces turned toward the empty pulpit. She ran home before dusk, refusing to cross the lane again. That August, a traveling peddler made camp beside the cemetery wall, unaware of the stories. He was found at dawn sitting cross-legged by the threshold, his wares stacked around him in a tidy circle. His mouth was filled with soot. In his palm, he held a slip of parchment that read, "We are never absent." When the locals tried to move him, they found his boots rooted to the frozen ground. Only when the first frost came did he slump forward, as if whatever had held him upright had finally finished speaking. Autumn arrived with a brittle hush that settled over the hollow like a held breath. The trees shed their leaves in unison, blanketing the churchyard in a damp, rust-coloured quilt. Each evening, as the last light slipped behind the ridge, the windows glimmered with a red so deep it looked more like a wound than a lamp. No flames ever showed themselves, but the air reeked of char and milk. The new schoolmaster, a man named Hollis, tried to hold lessons in the parsonage to distract the children from their fear. One morning, he found every desk marked with a small black handprint, each pressed into the wood as though the boards had softened to receive them. That night, he dreamed he was standing in the nave, the pews filled with silent watchers. A single candle burned on the pulpit. When he reached for it, the wax gave way beneath his hand, and something inside the wick opened an eye. He left the hollow before dawn, taking nothing but his boots and a single page torn from the Bible, a passage he could not remember copying, the ink fresh enough to smear. Some lights do not guide, they beckon. As December neared, the hush became a presence all its own, settling into bone and breath, pressing gently at the ribs. Mothers woke to find their children standing at the window, watching the church through the drifting snow. They would not speak, only raise a hand in a greeting no parent understood. On the final Sunday before Christmas, the bell tolled 3 times at dusk, though no one had touched the rope in years. By then, the families remaining in Briar Hollow had learned to let the church have its vigil. No candles were lit, no hymns were sung. The doors swung open by themselves, revealing the nave empty, but for a single pew turned sideways, as though awaiting an unseen guest. That night, the glow came not from flame, but from the walls themselves, pale and steady, bright enough to throw long shadows across the snow. And in that hush, some swore they heard breathing, not a chorus, not a lament, just the slow, measured exhale of something too patient to be called alive. When dawn came, the glow faded, and the doors drifted shut without a hand to guide them. A frost had gathered on every sill and lintel, a hoarfrost so thick it held the shape of what it touched, fingers trailing along banisters, palms pressed flat to the pew backs, the impression of small feet where no child had stepped. No one dared enter. Instead, they gathered at the edge of the yard, their breath misting in the hush. An old woman, half blind and near to leaving this world, whispered that the church was not a place anymore. It was a memory too strong to decay. As the sun rose, the frost began to melt, and beneath it, the wood showed no scorch or soot, as if the night had never happened. But every window bore a smear of ash on the inside, drawn in the shape of a hand turned palm out. The oldest among them said it was the church's way of marking who still watched. No one argued. No one returned to the steps. By Christmas Eve, the hollow lay silent as a sealed crypt. No carts passed the lane. No voices rose from the houses. And yet, just before midnight, the bell rang once, a single note that shivered through bone and glass alike. Those who had not fled pulled blankets tight, refusing to look outside. But a few too worn by years to pretend they were unafraid, watched from behind their curtains. They saw the doors swing wide to reveal a light within, soft and steady, like the glow of an ember cupped in two hands. No flame rose to consume the beams. No smoke drifted past the steeple. Only that hush, deeper than any snowfall, thickening until it seemed the air itself forgot how to move. When dawn finally came, the church remained unburned, the doors ajar, as though awaiting thanks. In the threshold lay a single length of charred rope, coiled neatly around a candle stub. Pressed into the wax was a print no wider than a newborn's palm. No one stepped forward to claim it. By the start of 1848, Briar Hollow was little more than a scattering of houses, held together by habit and dread. The road that once led travellers into the valley had sunken into muck so thick that wagon wheels vanished to the axle. Yet even when the parish fell from circuit maps, and no sermons rose from its pulpits, the church remained, whole, watchful. Each Christmas Eve, it continued its ritual, though in recent years, the fire had been replaced by that strange, unwavering light, and the hush that silenced even the crows. Some began to say the burning had only ever been the church's way of making itself known, a declaration in smoke and flame that it would not be ignored. Now the hush was worse, less spectacle, more claim. The first thaw of that year brought a final census taker from the county, a woman named Matilda Green, who'd heard enough of the Hollow's legend to pack salt in her skirts. She arrived with a clerk in tow and a sheaf of official papers. No one opened their doors to her knock. She recorded the silence faithfully, noting each empty homestead, each shuttered window, each sign of lives unthreaded without warning. But when she reached the church, she hesitated. Though the windows were dark, the door stood ajar in invitation. The clerk urged caution. Matilda stepped inside. Later he would swear that he heard her voice for hours, low and even, as if she was speaking to someone who never answered. When at last she emerged, her skirts were dusted with ash, though no fire had burned. She held a single candle, its stub set in a crust of blackened wax. In the wax the impression of a tiny foot, so perfect she could have counted the creases. She said nothing, only handed him the candle, and turned back down the lane, humming under her breath. The clerk did not follow. The hollow had claimed her, as it did all who stayed too long. After Matilda Green vanished into the hush, no more officials were dispatched. Word travelled quietly that Briar Hollow had closed itself. Still, those in the neighbouring counties whispered of the church, of the way its door never truly shut, and its bell never fully fell silent. That spring a trader passing through claimed he saw children gathered in the nave, sitting motionless along the pews. When he stepped closer, he realized they were not children at all, but bundles wrapped in linen, some no longer than an infant's forearm, some the length of a grown man's rib. Each bundle bore a single smear of soot. Across the place a face might have been. He did not linger. Yet when he reached the edge of the hollow, he found a small package tucked into his wagon, tied with coarse twine. Inside lay a strip of parchment with one sentence scrawled in a careful, curling hand. Some births never cease. By summer, the hush had deepened into something more deliberate, an atmosphere that pulled at the mind until even the most sensible souls began to feel they had always belonged to the hollow. Men who came only to collect debts found themselves pacing the churchyard at dusk, palms pressed to the frost that bloomed from the foundation stones. Women who had sworn never to cross the threshold woke from dreams of candle-lit pews and the scrape of something crawling through the nave on all fours. No one spoke of these visions aloud. The church, it seemed, was listening for its own name on every tongue. The first frost fell early that year, icing the ground in a thin white film that refused to melt. Beneath it the grass had begun to twist itself into spirals, delicate braids no larger than a child's hand, as though tiny fingers had shaped them in secret. And on Christmas Eve the bell tolled once more, just one note, deep enough to carry past the ridge and into every hearth. It was not a summons nor a warning, simply a reminder that the church was waiting, as it always had been. When dawn broke that Christmas, the church door stood wide to the cold. The hush was so complete that even the crows kept to their roosts, black eyes fixed on the nave as though they, too, were bound to witness. Those who dared approach the threshold spoke later of a warmth that pressed against their faces, not the gentle heat of a hearth, but the suffocating embrace of something that had no business lingering in wood and stone. A handful crept closer, compelled by curiosity or resignation. They found the pews arranged in 2 perfect rows, each draped in white linen stained dark at the center, as though something had been laid there and lifted away. At the pulpit stood a single cradle, carved from timber so black it gleamed like wet bone. Inside it lay a candle, spent to a nub, its wick buried in a pool of cooled tallow. In the wax as before, a mark, a child's handprint, smaller than any living infant's. They left it untouched. By nightfall, a frost had reclaimed the nave, crusting the cradle in delicate white. The parishioners retreated to their homes, but even behind shuttered windows, they could not escape the sense that something in the church was awake now, something that had waited long enough for its silence to become law. In the weeks that followed, children began to hum as they slept, the same low melody that had haunted 100 vigils. Mothers wept without understanding why. Fathers packed wagons under moonlight, abandoning houses still warm from the evening's fire. And when the roads out of the hollow vanished beneath drifts no snowstorm had laid, those who remained understood at last. The church was no longer a place. It was a memory with a mouth, and it had learned to speak. When the first thaw of 1849 arrived, it came not with warmth, but with a brittle cracking, as though the ground itself were splintering under the weight of what it had held. The church remained unchanged, its black beams slick with condensation that smelled faintly of singed wool. By then only 6 families remained in Briar Hollow, too old or too tired to run. They kept to their houses, pretending not to see the way frost crawled up the church walls each dusk. But on the last Sunday before Easter, a sound rose through the valley, a single resonant note that vibrated the windows in their panes. Those who listened closely swore it was not the bell, but the cradle, the same black timber that had returned year after year to the pulpit. It hummed in a slow, patient rhythm, as if it were marking time by a heartbeat no longer human. That night, a widow named Margaret Thorne set out with a lantern and a length of salt-twined rope. She had buried 2 children and a husband in that hollow, and had nothing left to fear. Neighbors watched her cross the yard, the frost parting under her boots. She did not pause at the threshold, but stepped inside. Hours passed without a stir. When dawn came, her lantern still burned on the first pew. Margaret was nowhere to be seen, but in the cradle, a fresh length of charred rope lay coiled around her wedding band. The gold blackened to a dull bruise. No one dared claim it, and when the hush settled again, it felt final, like the last breath drawn before a cry that would never come. After Margaret Thorne disappeared, the hush thickened into something the living could no longer deny. It pressed into every crevice, slid between the ribs, stole the warmth from any hearth that dared to burn past sundown. Those who remained began to seal their doors with pitch and nail boards across the windows. But even then, some nights brought the faint creak of floorboards bending under invisible weight, the hush broken by the sigh of something settling beside a bed. Children woke to find their blankets tugged tight across their chests, as if unseen hands were tucking them in. Mothers pressed their palms to small foreheads and found them cold as cellar stone. The church itself seemed to grow taller each week, the steeple looming against the sky with a hunger that could not be measured in wood or beam. By midsummer, the frost had returned, laying a thin film across the threshold even at noon. And always the cradle remained, sometimes at the pulpit, sometimes placed at the nave's center, as though inviting witness. The last pastor to stand in that doorway had died decades earlier, but his hymnal reappeared on the first pew, its cover warped by heat no fire had caused. Inside, every page had been scored with a single mark, a looped figure, neither letter nor number, repeated until the paper softened to pulp. When the harvest failed that year, crops shriveled in the fields. Though rain had fallen steady, families spoke openly of leaving. But the roads never cleared, wagons turned in circles, finding the same lane no matter how many times they changed course. One by one, they abandoned the attempt. They returned to their dim houses, set candles in their windows, and waited for the hush to choose its next name. And in the church, the cradle rocked in perfect silence, though no wind stirred to move it. Autumn arrived dressed in white, the frost creeping from the church steps to the farthest hedgerows, until every branch shone as if dipped in glass. On the last day of October, the hush deepened again, settling over the hollow like a veil laid across a corpse. Those who remained did not light their lamps that night. They knew better. From dusk until dawn, the church glowed, a steady, red ember at the heart of a valley that had forgotten how to speak. No flames rose, no voices called, but when morning came, the doors stood open, and something new waited on the threshold. It was a cradle, but not the same one that had returned year after year. This one was taller, its sides carved with shallow grooves that looked almost like writing. No one stepped close enough to be certain. A single blanket lay folded inside, woven from fibers so pale they appeared to shimmer in the weak daylight. Some said it was silk, others claimed it was hair, and at its center, pressed flat, as if by a gentle hand, rested a single candle, unlit, unblackened, its wick still pristine. Yet all who looked upon it felt the hush move in their chests, rooting itself deeper than breath. For weeks afterward, no one entered the church. The frost did not lift. The hush did not ease. Those who dared to peer through the warped glass claimed the cradle never shifted, but the blanket inside would sometimes rise and fall, as if a sleeper exhaled beneath it. And on the nights when the hush was at its most complete, even the oldest among them, those who had buried children, those who had watched the doors swing wide each Christmas Eve, felt something pass through their thoughts. Not a voice, not a word, only a certainty, cold and absolute, that one day the church would open its doors, and no one would be able to look away. Winter came early to Briar Hollow in 1850. The first snow fell before the last leaves had turned, blanketing the churchyard in a pallid hush, so thick it swallowed the crackle of hearth fires and the murmur of prayer. Those few who still claimed the hollow as home sealed their windows with oilcloth and stuffed rags into every gap, hoping to keep the cold and whatever else stalked the valley from crossing their thresholds. Yet no barrier could stop the hush. It seeped through walls, coiled in the corners of rooms, and pressed against the hearts of sleepers, until even dreams turned pallid and thin. By the second week of Advent, the hush had become a presence in every household, an unspoken understanding that the church was no longer content to remain merely a place of vigil. On the eve of St. Lucy's Day, a farmer named Abram Holt rose from his bed without candle or cloak, crossing the snow in bare feet. His wife watched through the frost-latticed window as he walked, steady and unhurried, toward the church door. She did not call after him, did not run to drag him back. Instead, she pressed her hand to the glass and felt the hush bloom inside her, filling her lungs until she could only watch in silence. When Abram reached the threshold, the door swung wide. A pale light pulsed inside, softer than any flame. He paused just long enough to look back, and though his wife would never speak of what she saw in his face, she carried that look into her grave. He stepped into the nave and vanished from sight. The door eased shut behind him, as though guided by unseen hands. No sound followed, no scent of smoke or wax, just the hush, drawing itself taut across the hollow like a cord pulled to breaking. At dawn, the church door stood ajar, the snow before it unmarked by any human track. Abram Holt was never found, but on the first pew, the cradle waited, taller than before, its rails etched with more of those shallow grooves that blurred the eye when stared at too long. Inside, The candle remained unlit. The blanket lay undisturbed. But pressed against the cradle's inner curve was something new. A single black feather, small enough to have fallen from a newborn's pillow, slick with a dampness that steamed in the cold. Those who gathered dared not step inside. They watched from the yard as the hush grew heavier, pooling in their chests, until each breath felt borrowed. It was the oldest among them, Martha Pell, whose son had been the first child laid in that church's earth, who finally spoke what none would voice. She whispered that the church had ceased to be a place of worship the first time it burned, that each Christmas Eve was not a remembrance but a labor, a birth, repeated and repeated, until the walls themselves remembered the shape of every sorrow carried within them, that the cradle was not a cradle at all, but a cradle-shaped mouth, waiting to be fed. The others turned their faces away. They shuffled home on legs made brittle by the cold, locking doors behind them, though they knew locks were only ritual by then. But Martha remained at the threshold, her breath feathering the hush. She lifted her hand as if to touch the cradle, then let it fall. In the end, even she turned back down the lane, knowing the church would not close its door. It never had. It only waited. That night, the hush pressed so deep that no child cried. No dogs barked. No crows called from the barren trees. The hollow became a single held breath, and though no flames rose and no bell tolled, every house awoke to the same sight at dawn. A single black feather laid across the doorstep, damp with a dew that smelled of old milk and ash. As the day shortened, and the hush sank into the marrow of every living thing, the few who remained in Briar Hollow began to understand that the hollow itself had been claimed, not by any spectre they could name, nor by the memory of the church's many burnings, but by something that had learned to root itself in the spaces left behind when faith collapsed and fear took up residence. The snow never fully thawed that winter. It crusted the fields in ridges that gleamed like frozen rib cages, blanketing every fence post and lintel in a white so pure it stung the eyes. The hush grew thicker, a velvet weight that blurred the line between waking and sleep. On the eve of Christmas, the hush gathered itself so completely that the air seemed to tighten around each house, sealing the occupants inside like insects trapped in amber. No one dared step outside, though all could feel the pull, a soft insistence beneath the breastbone that if they would only rise and walk, the church would open its door and offer them a place in whatever vigil it had prepared. Candles guttered in their sconces without gust or draught. Hearth fires collapsed into piles of sullen coals. Even the frost on the window panes seemed to draw back into itself, as though making way for something to look through from the other side. When the first bell tolled, once slow as a heartbeat, the hush shivered. Those who listened pressed hands to their ears, but it made no difference. The sound was not heard so much as known, a vibration in the bone that left the taste of milk and soot in the mouth. Some wept without knowing why. Others closed their eyes and prayed to be spared, though they did not know from what. The second bell struck, and the hush thickened into something close to grief. And then the third bell, so low it seemed to rise from the earth itself, rolled through the hollow like a final exhalation. When dawn came, the church doors stood wide. A fresh drift of snow had fallen in the night, smooth and unbroken save for one set of prints that led from the threshold to the cradle. They were small, bare, and spaced with the measured steps of a child no taller than a man's waist. The cradle itself glowed with a faint warmth that did not belong to fire or sun. Those who dared approach stopped short of the sill. Inside the cradle, the blanket had been turned back, and the candle had guttered into a pool of black wax. In that wax, the final mark had been pressed, a perfect impression of a tiny foot, side by side with a second larger print, one broad and long as a man's, the toes splayed as though bracing against the cradle's rim. No one could say what it meant. No one stepped across the threshold to learn more. The hush did not ease as the sun climbed higher. If anything, it seemed to grow clearer, as though all the years of burnings and silence had been preparation for this single morning when the church stood open, waiting for witness. But no witness came. Those who had survived too many winters turned back down the lane, carrying the hush inside them like a sickness that would never ease. And in the church the cradle cooled in the thin daylight, the candle's wick blackened, the prints preserved in their final arrangement. the small foot, the large and the silent space between them. By the new year, the hush had become the only truth Briar Hollow knew. No more wagons tried to leave. No more letters were sent beyond the valley. The families that remained had learned to keep their voices low, to bury their dead without ceremony, to avert their eyes from the church. Each dawn, some no longer bothered to lock their doors. What protection could a latch offer from something that had no need to cross a threshold to enter? Each night brought the same dream, the church door swinging wide to reveal the cradle, the candle guttering low, the hush drawing in like a tide, and always the sense that just beyond the nave, something waited, patient, unblinking, ancient as the wood itself. In late January, a young woman named Ruth Alton, one of the last children born before the hush had settled, walked from her family's house at dusk. She did not take a lantern. She did not dress for the cold. She moved as if following a path laid out long before she drew breath. Neighbors watched from their windows, hands pressed to glass, but no one called to her. To speak her name would be to acknowledge what they had all come to believe, that the church did not take at random. It called, and when it called, there was no refusal. Ruth stepped through the nave door without pausing. The hush shivered once, like the slow inhalation of something tasting the air, and then lay still. The hours between her entering and the dawn were longer than any the hollow had ever known. No frost crept up the eaves. No bell tolled, only the endless quiet, a silence so deep it erased the memory of voices. When the sun rose at last, the cradle stood alone in the center aisle, turned sideways as though to display its contents. The candle had been replaced with a new one, tall, pale, unlit. Across the folded blanket, a single strand of long dark hair lay coiled like a question, and pressed into the wax was the smallest print yet, no bigger than a newborn's hand. No one claimed the cradle. No one touched the door. Ruth was never seen again, though her mother said she sometimes woke to hear a child's breathing in the next room. A soft, steady rhythm she had not heard since Ruth was an infant. When she rose to look, the hush would press itself against her chest until she had to kneel, her breath coming in small, desperate sips. In time she stopped trying. She learned to sit still in the dark, listening as the hush pulsed against the walls of her house, marking time in heartbeats that were not her own. Spring came late that year. When the thaw arrived, it did not melt the snow around the church. The drifts remained smooth and cold, preserving every footprint like a testament. No grass sprouted in the yard. No birds returned to the eaves, and each dawn the door stood ajar, as though waiting for the next to enter. In the hollow no one spoke of escape anymore. They did not plan for planting or marriage or birth. They learned to move carefully, to keep their eyes lowered, and to breathe shallow in the hush, because some knew, though they could never have said how, that the church's vigil was not done, that the hush was not an ending, but a preparation. One evening, as the last light drained from the sky, the bell rang once more, a single note that shivered through every house and every heart. In its echo, the hush seemed almost to sigh, and for a moment, the hollow remembered the way it had felt before the first burning, before the first unclaimed cradle, before the first midnight fire. Then the hush drew itself close again, sealing that memory away like something too precious to be left in the open. The doors remained open, the candle remained unlit, and the hush waited, as it always had, for the next name to be spoken. If you've stayed with me through this long recounting, you already understand. Some places are never abandoned. They are only allowed to rest until we have the nerve to remember them. The church in Briar Hollow was never just a place of worship. It was never simply a building raised by hands or raised by fire. It was a cradle, built to hold something older than any congregation, something that wore the shape of a house of God, but never bent to any scripture. Each Christmas Eve, when the hush descended and the candle guttered, the hollow bore witness to the same quiet labor, not a burning but a birth, or perhaps a return. And every year when the snow smothered the footprints, and the doors swung wide to the dark, someone felt that call. Someone heard the bell toll in their marrow. Ask those who survived why they never fled, and they'll struggle to find words. Fear is too small a reason, so is hope. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that the church was never content to be a story left behind, that it reached into dreams, into breath, into the hush between heartbeats, until you knew it was already inside you, that no distance could loosen its hold, no forgetting could unmake its memory. Even now, when the valley no longer appears on maps, when no cartographer bothers to note the black steeple and the leaning graves, the hush remains. And sometimes in the deep of winter, travelers swear they've glimpsed a light where no road leads, soft as an ember, steady as a heartbeat, a church that should not stand, a cradle that never empties, a door that never truly shuts. If you wake one night and hear the hush moving through your house, slow, patient, pressing against the walls like a hand seeking a pulse, don't look for its source, don't call out for reassurance, and above all, if you find a single black feather on your doorstep, still warm with a breath you cannot name, do not speak its name aloud, because some vigils are eternal, some places never forget, and some fires, once kindled, burn without flame, warming the cradle that waits behind every closed door.